Imagine standing in the shadow of history in a time when silence held more than stillness, when it echoed with the memory of a man whose words had moved empires of the soul. Picture 500 monks gathered beneath the jagged overhang of a great stone cave, the air heavy with incense and the weight of what had just been lost. Buddha was gone. His body had passed, but his teachings, that vast ocean of wisdom flowing from his lips for over 4 decades, still lingered in the minds of those who followed him. But they had a problem. There were no scriptures, no inked pages, no chiseled stone tablets, only memory. One voice rises from the assembly. "I remember it this way," the monk says, confident. Then another interrupts. "No, that's not what he said." They all remember, but each remembers differently. And that's the terrifying beauty of it. The truth, if not protected, was about to fragment, dissolve, perhaps even vanish. Fast forward more than 2,000 years, and scholars have now uncovered something shocking. We may have lost more than half of the Buddha's original teachings. Not just interpretations or metaphors, but entire swaths of instruction, teachings that once guided lives, shaped civilizations, and whispered answers into the dark corners of suffering. What makes this discovery even more haunting is how it came to light. Not in glittering temples or celebrated libraries, but buried in forgotten caves, hidden under layers of dust and silence. Clay pots, cracked with age, yielded scrolls that hadn't seen daylight in centuries. Inside them were messages not echoed in any modern canon, teachings no one had recited in 1,000 years. And suddenly we're faced with a staggering realization. The Buddhism we know today may be a fragment, a brilliant but partial reflection of a far deeper original. Consider this. For the first 400 years after Buddha's death, not a single word of his teaching was written down. It was all preserved through memory. Oral tradition was the lifeblood of the early Sangha, a mental discipline so intense it demanded monks memorize thousands of verses, sermons, instructions, word for word. It's the equivalent of asking someone to recite every Marvel film, not just by plot, but by every line, every gesture, every pause. Then multiply that by 1,000. That's what they were preserving, and they had no choice. Buddha had passed. His teachings were like stars scattered across the night sky, bright, endless, but vulnerable. That first council, 3 months after his death, was held in a real cave. Yes, we know the location, and yes, we have the texts. This is not legend, it's historical record. Their mission was simple and monumental: preserve everything. For 7 months they sat together, reciting, debating, confirming. But here's where it gets murky. What did they leave out? See, not all the teachings made it. Some were deemed too radical, too wild, too risky. And so they vanished. Not in flames or riots, but by quiet omission. Lost not because of war, but because of choice. Fragments of what didn't make the cut have started to emerge from archaeological digs in places like Afghanistan and Pakistan, ancient lands once pulsing with Buddhist life. These bits and pieces don't just expand our understanding, they challenge it. They paint a Buddha who was perhaps more pragmatic, more experimental, more personal than the one we've inherited. One monk, Ananda, Buddha's personal attendant, and the man who probably heard more of his master's words than anyone else, was nearly banned from the very council meant to preserve the teachings. Why? Because he wasn't yet fully enlightened. Imagine that. The guardian of the Buddha's voice almost silenced. Another monk, Subhata, stood and said something so bold it was recorded forever in one of Buddhism's oldest texts. He essentially said the rules were up for grabs now, that Buddha was gone and new leadership could shape the future. His timing was chilling. Buddha's body wasn't even cold in memory, and already the reshaping had begun. What follows is a game of memory stretched across generations. Think of the children's game telephone, where a message gets passed from person to person, warping with each retelling. Now stretch that game across centuries and continents. That's what happened to Buddhist teachings. We know because we have the receipts, multiple versions of the same sermons, preserved in China, Sri Lanka, Tibet, each one with its own twists, additions, omissions. Take Buddha's first sermon. There are 17 surviving versions. 17. Some contain meditation instructions, others don't. Some emphasize philosophical insights, others practical guidance. These aren't minor differences. They could have altered the way millions of people practice Buddhism today, and yet those threads of thought, those vanishing teachings, are only now being rediscovered. In the early 1990s, a farmer stumbled into a cave in Afghanistan. Inside were scrolls, fragile, brittle, precious. Written in ancient Gandhar on birch bark, they dated back to the 1st century BCE. When scholars finally translated them, they found teachings that didn't exist anywhere else. Entire practices, stories of the Buddha, methods of meditation that contradicted the standard doctrine. It was like finding deleted scenes from a spiritual epic, moments that could shift everything we thought we knew. Here's a fascinating detail. Modern Buddhism often emphasizes meditation as a structured, almost scientific process, step by step, breath by breath. But in the earliest texts, many of those instructions are missing. It's as if we have the theory, but someone tore out the manual. That manual might have contained advice Buddha gave to people from every walk of life. A merchant asking how to stay mindful in business, a warrior seeking peace in battle, a mother struggling to stay centered while raising children. We know these conversations happened. The questions survived, but the answers? Gone. Wiped clean from history like chalk from a board. But not all hope is lost. Hidden in Chinese monasteries, buried under centuries of dust, archaeologists have unearthed texts from the 4th to 11th centuries, texts that include real instructions, actual words attributed to Buddha on how to deal with anger, sorrow, distraction. And they're different. Not wildly so, but enough to raise eyebrows, enough to make us ask, which version is closer to the truth? Let's talk about what we know we lost. Ancient references tell us Buddha offered deeply personal teachings, advice tailored to kings, farmers, tradespeople. We know these existed. We have mentions, almost like chapter headings from a book whose pages were ripped out. And what about the voices of women in early Buddhism? They weren't just present, they were powerful. Buddha's stepmother, Mahaprajapati, was the first Buddhist nun. Her teachings, her experiences, should have been preserved. But nearly everything she said was erased. It gets worse. Over 500 enlightened nuns are named in ancient records, but their words vanished. Only one small collection of poems remains, like embers glowing in a fire long extinguished. In 2019, that changed. Hidden in the vast silence of a Tibetan library, scholars found fragments, actual teachings from Buddhist women. Not just poetry, but methodology, instruction, approaches to enlightenment that had been buried not by war, but by neglect. There was Kema, a queen-turned-nun. Her intellect rivaled any of Buddha's male disciples. She impressed kings, shifted hearts. Today, only one of her conversations survives. One. The rest, erased. But art remembers what text forgets. In caves painted with centuries-old murals, women are depicted teaching large assemblies, even men. The images contradict our surviving texts. They whisper of a time when women shaped Buddhism's core, not just as students, but as masters. Why did their teachings vanish? Some believe they were erased on purpose. Others say it was the slow erasure of time. Either way, the impact is immense, because losing those voices means losing half the perspective, half the insight, half the light. Now imagine this. Self-help books line every shelf today, each promising calm, purpose, healing. Yet 2.5 millennia ago, Buddha was already offering practical wisdom on those same issues. How to breathe through illness, how to cope with pain, how to sleep better, how to live ethically. But these teachings, gone. Sometimes hinted at, sometimes mentioned. But the meat, the how-to, disappeared. In northern India, researchers found medical manuscripts from Buddha's era. They spoke of body scanning techniques, something modern meditation has reintroduced as cutting edge. Turns out, Buddha might have taught it first. And there's more. In a monastery once visited by the Chinese pilgrim Xuanzang, he recorded seeing texts that explained daily living advice from Buddha himself, how to handle conflict, raise children, face emotional storms. Xuanzang wanted to bring them home, but before he could return, the monastery was gone, reduced to ash. Still, the trail continues. In 2001, in another cave in Afghanistan, scrolls emerged that contained teachings we'd never seen before. Advice on meditation for different personalities, instructions on how to balance spiritual practice with the chaos of everyday life. It tells us something powerful. Buddha's message wasn't meant for monks alone. It was meant for merchants, warriors, mothers, farmers, people like us. People with jobs, dreams, debts, heartbreaks. We've just begun to rediscover that. Somewhere deep in the Afghan mountains, where silence swallows sound and the wind speaks only in echoes, a shepherd stumbled upon something no one had seen for over 2,000 years. A cave, hidden, ordinary from the outside. But inside, sitting patiently through time, lay scrolls older than many religions, older than any empire that ever laid claim to the region. Birch bark, fragile, rolled tightly, still holding together despite the centuries. When those scrolls were finally unrolled and their script translated, they shook the foundation of Buddhist history. They weren't just texts, they were witnesses. Witnesses to a version of the Buddha that no one alive had known. A version long lost beneath dust, war, and forgetting. These were the Gandharan scrolls, dating to around the 1st century BCE. And they didn't just add to what we knew. They contradicted it. They offered stories of the Buddha that didn't match the official canon. They described meditation that had no mention of breath, no fixation on posture. It was raw, immediate, different. They revealed that enlightenment wasn't always viewed as a destination requiring lifetimes. Some believed it could happen in a single breath, a single life. One decision, one realization, and the chains could fall. In the Bamyan Valley, where 2 colossal Buddha statues once gazed down at the earth for 15 centuries before being destroyed, archaeologists made another discovery. Beneath an ancient monastery, they uncovered what appeared to be a library, one forgotten by time, possibly abandoned during one of the many waves of conquest that swept the region. What they found inside would redefine centuries of spiritual belief. Manuscripts that spoke not just of philosophy or ethics, but of healing, of medicine, of the Buddha not only as a spiritual teacher, but a physician of both mind and body. In 2017, high in a remote Tibetan cave barely touched by civilization, another bombshell emerged. Scrolls again. But these weren't philosophical treatises. They were practical. They contained teachings about trauma, illness, imbalance. Teachings that eerily mirrored what modern psychology and neuroscience are only now starting to validate. The Buddha wasn't just trying to lift people into a transcendental state. He was guiding them through their very human struggles: grief, anger, addiction, confusion. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? Why were these teachings lost? Was it neglect? Was it fear? Or was it simply time doing what time does, letting go of what isn't constantly held? Today we have tools the ancients could never have imagined. Artificial intelligence is helping scholars read faded scrolls, parsing damaged texts character by character. Hyperspectral cameras are revealing invisible ink. Ground-penetrating radar is finding temples buried beneath layers of soil and ruin. And as each fragment surfaces, we're given a glimpse of the Buddha as he might have actually been. Not the icon, not the statue in golden robes, but the man, the teacher, the listener. This is why you might notice something strange when you look across the different branches of Buddhism. One teacher might say, meditation must be challenging, almost a test of endurance. Another might insist it should be effortless, natural. These aren't contradictions born of confusion. They're echoes of teachings adapted for different people, different needs, different times. But when half the teachings are gone, the map becomes harder to read, and everyone starts drawing their own. Take mindfulness, now commodified into apps and corporate training sessions. You might think it's a modern invention, but it's rooted in ancient practice. The problem is, many of the original teachings about mindfulness are gone. Scraps of scrolls recently uncovered hint that Buddha taught mindfulness in ways far more nuanced than we've inherited. Techniques that change depending on personality, mood, social setting. Techniques for leaders, for lovers, for the grieving. We've simplified them to breath awareness and body scans, but the original library might have been vast. And then there's the lost advice, the kind of wisdom that sounds eerily like the best of modern self-help, but offered millennia ago. Teachings about relationships, about money, about how to raise children with compassion. The fragments we do have suggest that Buddha spoke clearly and often about real-life problems, not just lofty truths. He gave ethical advice for merchants. He spoke about friendship, about dealing with betrayal. He talked about power and how it corrupts. And now those teachings are scattered like torn pages in a storm. Let's zoom in on a place many never associate with Buddhism, Afghanistan. Once the beating heart of the Dharma, thousands of monasteries once crowned its ridgelines, each a sanctuary of learning and reflection. But those temples weren't just homes for monks. They were repositories. Every monastery housed scrolls, and every scroll was a heartbeat of the Buddha's voice. When the invasions came, when the winds of time turned violent, these teachings didn't just fade, they were erased, not out of hatred for Buddha necessarily, but out of the slow entropy that destroys everything not constantly renewed. Move south to what is now Pakistan. In the ancient kingdom of Gandhara, Buddhist universities once flourished. Think of them as ancient Ivy Leagues, places where students traveled across continents to learn, from China, from Korea, from Japan. These students came to access vast libraries, some holding teachings we no longer even know existed. When archaeologists discovered the Gilgit manuscripts, written on delicate birch bark, they found an entirely different expression of Buddhism. Not better, not worse, just different. More grounded, more pluralistic. These texts spoke of evolving thought, of a tradition adapting itself without fear. But even that adaptation had its limits. When war descended on these sacred spaces, texts were burned, monks scattered, and with them went philosophies, interpretations, entire schools of thought. Some teachings may have survived only in memory, and when those who remembered died, the teachings died with them. In Indonesia, the story gets stranger. Standing proudly in central Java is the world's largest Buddhist temple, Borobudur, a monument so massive and intricate, it seems impossible that its builders could have disappeared. And yet they did. The civilization that created Borobudur is long gone, and so are their specific beliefs. What branch of Buddhism did they follow? What teachings shaped their lives? We don't know, not fully. The architecture tells us they were deeply philosophical, obsessed with cosmology and the soul's journey. But the details, the sermons, The practices, lost. Cross the vast deserts of Central Asia, and more ghosts emerge. Along the ancient Silk Road, archaeologists uncovered Buddhist manuscripts written in languages no one speaks anymore. Whole communities lived, worshipped, evolved with their own understanding of the Dharma, then vanished, dried out by climate change, destroyed by invaders, or perhaps they simply dissolved, their teachings forgotten because no one thought to write them down before it was too late. Each of these places, Afghanistan, Gandhara, Indonesia, Central Asia, once held their own Buddhist canons, their own sacred instructions, and each time one of those civilizations vanished, a unique version of Buddhism disappeared with it. It's as if the religion wasn't just one stream, but a river delta with countless branches, each carrying a different flavor, a different truth. And now we're left trying to understand the river by studying a few surviving branches. Let's circle back to the end, to the Buddha's final moments. We know his last words, at least the ones that made it into the text. All compounded things are subject to decay. Strive on with diligence. But older sources suggest there was more, that he gave secret teachings, specific instructions for future generations, and that these teachings were hidden, guarded, perhaps even encrypted for protection. One mystery speaks of teachings reserved for a future Buddha, Maitreya. These weren't just predictions or myths. Some scrolls claim that Buddha personally designated certain teachings to be preserved until the time was right, until someone could understand and teach them again. Where are they? Some say they were inscribed on copper plates and hidden in Himalayan caves. Others believe they were taken to a hidden kingdom, beyond our maps, beyond our comprehension. To this day, no one has found them. Even Buddha's relics, his bowl, his robe, his ashes, were said to contain teachings. Not just symbols, but actual wisdom encoded in ritual, passed hand to hand, generation to generation. But one by one, these relics disappeared, stolen, lost, destroyed. Or perhaps they still lie waiting beneath soil, in ruins no one has thought to search. The greatest mystery, of course, is this. We don't know what we don't know. Every year, more fragments surface. A scroll, a mural, a forgotten language suddenly translated. And each time, our image of the Buddha changes slightly. A detail shifts, a nuance emerges, a contradiction arises, and the teacher we thought we knew, calm, serene, stoic, suddenly becomes more real, more complex, more human. We are left with the echo of something immense, a teaching so wide, so deep, it still transforms lives, even in pieces. Maybe that's the miracle, that despite everything lost, what remains is still powerful. Still healing, still enough to change a heart, but it also means we should stay curious, keep searching, because the Buddha's voice wasn't one note, it was a symphony, and somewhere, in the deserts, in the mountains, in the silence of forgotten caves, the rest of the music still waits to be heard. Long before the first Buddhist statue was ever carved, before temples stretched into skies or monks wrapped themselves in ochre robes, there was only a man walking dusty roads, speaking in plain words about suffering, desire, and peace. His voice wasn't meant for gods or scholars. It was for people, ordinary and flawed, like the ones who filled his path with questions. But what if most of those answers have vanished? What if the heart of his teachings, the warmth of his guidance, lies not in what we've preserved, but in what we've forgotten? The early monks knew this danger. That's why they clung so fiercely to memory. For 400 years, they passed down Buddha's words without writing a single syllable. Not because they couldn't write, writing existed, but because memory was considered sacred, more reliable than ink. Writing to them was fallible, changeable, too easy to tamper with. So they trained their minds until they became living libraries, reciting hundreds of thousands of verses. Imagine that. Every day, every night, the rhythm of chanting echoing through monasteries, keeping truth alive one breath at a time. But memory isn't perfect. It bends, it morphs, it forgets. And by the time the first texts were written, something had already shifted. It was during a famine in Sri Lanka that the fear set in. Monks were dying, starving, and with them, centuries of memorized teachings were at risk of disappearing forever. So they did something unprecedented. They wrote it down. Palm leaves became pages. Ink became memory's safety net. And the result was the Pali Canon, still one of the most revered collections in Theravada Buddhism. Yet even that great work was a snapshot, a version, a choice. It reflected the voices of those monks in Sri Lanka, their interpretations, their decisions on what mattered most. Meanwhile, in China, other monks were doing the same, translating what they had received, adding their own understanding. In Tibet, others worked from different oral lineages, preserving yet another flavor of the Dharma. None of them were wrong, but none of them were complete. Take the famous story of the Buddha's enlightenment under the Bodhi tree. It's the cornerstone of his life. But look closely, and you'll find multiple versions. In one, he's attacked by demons who hurl weapons and temptations. In another, it's an entirely inward battle, a meditation on emptiness and perception. These aren't just dramatic retellings. They reflect profound differences in spiritual philosophy, and they suggest that over time, teachings adapted not just in words but in essence. And what about the ordinary teachings, the ones meant for day-to-day life? Buddha didn't just speak about nirvana. He taught people how to live, how to breathe through pain, how to care for aging parents, how to work honestly, love truthfully, speak kindly. These teachings were shared again and again in the markets, in homes, on village paths. But they weren't glamorous. They weren't esoteric. And so many weren't preserved, not because they lacked value, but because they seemed too familiar, too obvious. But now fragments are emerging that suggest these so-called obvious teachings held deep wisdom. A recently uncovered scroll spoke of the 4 supports for a householder. It listed ways to balance ambition with contentment, spiritual growth with daily responsibility. Another fragment from Central Asia detailed practices for managing grief after losing a loved one. Not metaphorically, but practically, rituals and meditations designed for the pain of real loss. These weren't lofty discourses, they were emotional lifelines. And this makes sense. The Buddha traveled constantly, speaking not to kings alone, but to farmers, potters, traders, children. They came to him not for abstract philosophy, but for help, for understanding, for comfort, and he gave it to them. But over centuries, as Buddhism became formalized, institutionalized, many of these tender, personalized teachings fell away. There's one story, recorded only in a single obscure Tibetan manuscript, of a weaver's daughter who came to the Buddha in tears. Her father had died suddenly and she couldn't find peace. She asked why she felt empty even though she meditated every day. And the Buddha, instead of giving a sermon, simply sat beside her. Then he asked about her father. What kind of man was he? What did he teach you? Slowly her grief softened. The teaching wasn't in the words, it was in the silence, the presence. But even this story nearly disappeared, kept alive only because one monk chose to record it differently. And what of the lost voices of the Buddhist women, whose stories continue to surface like letters from a forgotten world? Mahaprajapati wasn't just the first nun. She was a reformer, a fighter. She walked hundreds of miles to request ordination for herself and other women. She pleaded not for equality in status, but in spiritual opportunity, and she succeeded. But after her, silence. We have names of hundreds of nuns who reached enlightenment, but their teachings, gone. They didn't write them. No one recorded them. And so history left them behind. That's why a single collection, tiny, fragile, called the Therigatha is so important. It's a set of poems by early Buddhist nuns. Their voices are sharp, direct, unflinching. They speak of desire, loss, aging, transcendence. These aren't flowery verses. They are the raw truths of women who walked away from everything, who found clarity not in palaces, but in solitude. They reveal a kind of spiritual independence rarely emphasized in other texts. And they beg the question, what else did these women know? What did they teach in the years that followed? Paintings on cave walls in India and Central Asia show women teaching men, leading meditations, guiding assemblies. But we don't have the scripts for those teachings, just the images, mute and glowing, left to be interpreted. It's as though history has tried to erase them, but art refused. There are even rarer records, like those found in a Tibetan archive in 2019, which show how some female teachers used different metaphors, different breath work, different emphasis in their path to awakening. They approach mindfulness not as discipline, but as intimacy with self, with others, with suffering. These teachings weren't weaker. They weren't lesser. They were just different. And their absence has left a hole in what we call Buddhism today. Now imagine if you had access to all those teachings, the ones lost, the ones buried, the ones sung by monks in dialects no longer spoken, teachings about chronic illness, parenting, ethical business, grief, dreams, desire. What would your practice look like then? Because this is the real miracle, that even in fragments, Buddhism still works. Even with entire volumes missing, it still leads people out of suffering. That's the power of truth. It survives, it reshapes. It finds its way through silence and stone, through the slow dust of centuries. But what if we found more? What if the next cave revealed Buddha's direct advice for navigating our modern world? How to handle information overload. How to find silence when the world never sleeps. How to feel compassion when everything feels transactional. What if those answers were already given, just waiting to be found? It's not impossible. Technology is now allowing archaeologists and historians to read scrolls too fragile to open. Multispectral imaging is revealing text hidden beneath other writing. And with every new breakthrough, more teachings surface. The map gets clearer, the voice gets louder, and the Buddha we thought we knew becomes something more intimate, more human, more revolutionary. And maybe that's what we've lost the most. Not just information, but the relationship. The sense that the Buddha was near, speaking to you directly, not in riddles or sermons, but in the language of your own life. Maybe the greatest treasure we can rediscover is not a manuscript, but the sense that wisdom isn't just in monasteries or texts, but in conversations, in questions, in the shared experience of what it means to be alive. Maybe the teachings haven't been lost after all. Maybe they're just waiting to be heard differently. In a corner of ancient northern India, not far from where rivers meander through soft earth and monks once walked barefoot paths between villages, archaeologists uncovered something few expected. Old medical manuscripts written in faded ink on yellowing palm leaves detailed not only herbal treatments or healing chants, but something profoundly familiar. Body scanning, the very same body awareness technique now taught in modern mindfulness programs, rooted in neuroscience and psychology. Only this wasn't new. It was ancient. It was once taught by Buddha himself, or so the texts claim. And yet those original instructions are gone, fragmented, incomplete. We're left wondering what else we've reinvented that might have already been mastered, explained, and passed down, if only the scrolls had survived. The story doesn't stop there. A Chinese monk named Xuanzang once traveled all the way to India, crossing treacherous terrain for the sole purpose of collecting the Buddha's teachings. He reached a monastery where monks preserved texts on relationships, conflict resolution, even emotional intelligence, thousands of years before those terms would ever be coined. Xuanzang planned to return and translate them for the world, but by the time he came back, the monastery had been destroyed, its texts lost in fire and rubble. What was written there, teachings about how to be human in the messiness of everyday life, was gone before anyone outside ever got to read it. Still, the story continues in moments of grace and luck. In 2001, researchers in Afghanistan unearthed scrolls that contained teachings no Buddhist community today had ever practiced. They weren't about escaping the world, they were about engaging with it. Instructions on how to meditate if you're constantly distracted. Advice on how to balance spiritual pursuit with earning a living. Tailored practices for people with different temperaments. Those who overthink, those who are quick to anger, those who avoid emotions. This wasn't abstract philosophy. This was practical survival. And once again, the question rises, if this kind of personal guidance existed, why didn't it endure? The answer might be uncomfortably simple. The teachings that survive are the ones repeated, protected, canonized. But what about the teachings meant just for you, spoken in a quiet moment under a fig tree or whispered on a long walk between villages? Those would have been passed heart to heart. And if the last heart holding them stopped beating without a scribe nearby, that wisdom evaporated. No dramatic destruction, no fire or war, just silence. Buddha's approach was intensely personal. He didn't give the same answer to everyone. A warrior and a child might both ask about fear, but he would speak to each in a different language, using different metaphors, with different paths toward courage. Some of those paths were recorded, many were not. But every once in a while, a door cracks open. In dusty monasteries beneath crumbling stone, archaeologists find traces of those vanished conversations. One scroll discovered in Western China contains a meditation unlike anything in modern Buddhist instruction. It was visual, sensory-rich, almost like a lucid dream designed to train the mind in compassion through imagining strangers suffering and healing them with thought. Today, we call this metta or loving kindness meditation. But the version in that scroll had steps, stages, psychological insights lost in later adaptations. It was a manual, and it was forgotten until someone literally dug it up. Think of it this way. For 2,500 years, people have been trying to reconstruct a puzzle with missing pieces, not realizing that entire sections of the picture were never included in the box. And now pieces are turning up in caves, in private collections, in monastery archives, misfiled for generations. Each time we add one, the image changes. Not drastically, but meaningfully. A detail we misunderstood becomes clear. A forgotten technique reemerges. A silenced voice begins to speak. One of the most haunting examples involves a form of teaching we've only recently begun to find in fragments: ethical instruction about money. The modern world treats wealth and spirituality like oil and water, but Buddha apparently didn't. He taught lay people how to earn money ethically, how to spend it with compassion, how to use wealth to create peace rather than attachment. Some scrolls suggest he gave step-by-step guidance on managing a household budget, on dealing with envy among merchants, on navigating economic hardship with mindfulness. Those scrolls weren't preserved because later monks, often celibate and removed from commerce, didn't see their value. They focused on liberation, renunciation, transcendence, and rightly so. But in doing so, they left behind teachings meant for people who couldn't leave the world, who had to live within it. It's happening again today. Look around. People are searching. They're learning to meditate through apps. They're exploring Buddhism through Instagram quotes and YouTube videos. They're trying to piece together lives of meaning without necessarily becoming monks. And while the teachings that remain still help, powerfully so, there's a hunger for something more specific. How do I forgive someone who doesn't apologize? How do I stay kind when I'm exhausted? How do I find meaning when everything feels digital and disconnected? The answers might have already been given. In a cave, perhaps. In a scroll no one's yet translated. In a song once sung by a nun whose name has been remembered, but whose voice was forgotten. We just haven't heard them yet. Consider this. Modern research has shown that meditation can help with depression, anxiety, trauma. But it also reveals that meditation isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. Some people feel worse. Some feel nothing. Some struggle with sitting still. Ancient texts suggest the Buddha knew this. He gave alternative methods, moving meditations, chanting, visualizations, acts of service. He understood the mind's diversity. But the details of these alternatives are mostly gone. Reconstructed through modern creativity, yes, but not from source material, from educated guesses. Yet the glimpses we do get are encouraging. In recent decades, a surge of scrolls and inscriptions have begun to challenge long-held assumptions. They show us a Buddha who was not just a mystic, but a psychologist, a poet, a healer, a social reformer. Someone who understood trauma, grief, relationships. Someone who didn't just want us to transcend the world, but also to love it wisely. And maybe that's the core of what's been lost. Not just teachings, but the spirit behind them. The Buddha wasn't trying to build an empire. He wasn't creating a religion as much as a conversation. A conversation about what it means to be alive, to suffer, to seek freedom. And in that conversation, every voice mattered. But voices fade, especially the ones that don't get recorded. The ones spoken in private moments between teacher and student, mother and child, traveler and stranger. And yet some of those voices still linger in poems, in art, in architecture, in the rhythm of chants that have survived for centuries. If you listen closely, you can almost hear them. Echoes, yes, but not empty. Echoes that still carry warmth, guidance, presence. Because here's the quiet truth. Even though we've lost much, even though entire libraries have turned to dust, the teachings that remain have carried people through storms for centuries. They have calmed minds, opened hearts, inspired revolutions of the soul. And now, as more pieces return to the surface, we're offered not just more knowledge, but a chance to rediscover the Buddha as he truly was. Layered, compassionate, deeply human. So the next time you sit in silence, following your breath, know that you're part of a lineage far older than any scripture. A lineage of seekers, of listeners, of rememberers. And somewhere, in a forgotten cave or buried beneath the sand, another fragment waits, patient, still holding the next piece of the story, ready to be heard again. In a time when the world knew no borders drawn in ink, where kings ruled not only by sword but by story, and where dusty paths connected ancient cities like arteries of thought, Buddhism traveled, not just the teachings, but the teacher's voice, carried in memory, in murmured recitations, in chants echoing across deserts and forests. As monks walked from India into the sweeping expanse of Asia, they brought the Dharma with them. But they didn't just bring words. They brought interpretations, translations, assumptions, each one coloring the teaching slightly differently, like refracted light. And in those subtle shifts, things began to change. Imagine walking into an ancient library in China, sometime around the 4th century. Scrolls line the walls, each one a fragile vessel of the Buddha's words, but not in his language. They're in Chinese, painstakingly translated by monks who sometimes had to invent new characters to express concepts that didn't exist in their native tongue. These weren't just linguistic conversions. They were spiritual recalibrations. When Sanskrit became Chinese, some meanings expanded, others contracted, some vanished. In the process, Buddha's voice became a little less his and a little more theirs. And yet, that transformation allowed Buddhism to survive. Without it, the teachings might never have reached places like Korea or Japan. But every translation is a choice. Every omission, every rewording shifts the shape of truth. And sometimes whole teachings were left behind because they were deemed too foreign, too complex, too personal. These weren't malicious edits. They were human ones. And their consequences echo even now. When archaeologists today find fragments in long-forgotten dialects, Gandhar, Khotanese, Sogdian, they often reveal surprising details. A phrase spoken in one version of a sutra might appear completely different in another. A metaphor lost in Tibetan might flourish in a Chinese edition. It's as if the Buddha's message traveled through 1,000 mirrors, each reflecting something slightly different, none capturing the full light. And in these reflections, we catch glimpses of what was once whole. Take meditation. In the modern world, it's been boiled down to breath, posture, stillness. But the oldest texts hint at a much richer landscape. Meditation wasn't a uniform practice. It was a living dialogue between the mind and the world. Some practices were visual, others auditory. Some involved storytelling, movement, even laughter. In one recovered scroll, meditation was described as a way to knead the mind like dough, to soften it, shape it, let it rise. That metaphor doesn't exist in any mainstream manual today, but once someone found it powerful enough to record, it gets even more fascinating. In one remote region of Central Asia, archaeologists found a meditation manual tailored specifically for artists. It guided the practitioner to focus not on breath or silence, but on form, on color, on the moment of creation. The practice was to paint as meditation, to sculpt as mindfulness. It was a method the Buddha allegedly shared with artisans who couldn't sit still, who found God in movement, not stillness. Imagine how that version of mindfulness might look today in a world of creatives and makers. But it was lost, almost. And then there's the matter of the Buddha's daily life. So little survives about his habits, his preferences, his routines. What did he eat when he wasn't fasting? How did he prepare for public talks? Did he laugh often? Did he comfort others with touch or with silence? Most modern representations paint him as distant,